Picture this. You're at a family dinner, the kind where the food is great, but the questions are better. And right on cue, someone across the table leans in and says it. So, are you seeing anyone? And when you say no, there it is, that look, that slight tilt of the head, that flicker of concern, like you've just told them you haven't eaten in 3 weeks, like being single is the condition you need to recover from. We've all been there. Whether you're the single person at the table or the one doing the leaning, we've absorbed this cultural story that says being in a relationship equals emotional health, and being single, especially by choice, equals something broken, something missing, something to fix. But what if the psychology tells a completely different story? Today, we're going inside the minds of people who stay single, not the ones desperately waiting for the right person, but the ones who are genuinely okay, maybe even thriving. We're going to look at what's actually happening psychologically, neurologically, and emotionally. And I think by the end of this, you might see singlehood in a way you never have before. Let's start by dismantling a myth. There's a widespread assumption that people who stay single are either unlucky or avoidant, that they just haven't met the right person yet, or they're secretly scared of intimacy, running from commitment, nursing some old wound. And look, sometimes that's true. Attachment theory, pioneered by John Bowlby and later expanded by researchers like Cindy Hazen and Philip Shaver, tells us that our early experiences with caregivers shape how we connect with people for the rest of our lives. Some people do pull away from closeness because closeness once hurt them. That's real, and it deserves compassion. But here's where it gets interesting. Researchers at the University of Buffalo conducted studies on what they called single-at-heart individuals, people who weren't just tolerating singlehood, but actively preferred it. And what they found cuts against everything your aunt at dinner believes. These individuals weren't more depressed, more anxious, or more socially isolated than their coupled counterparts. In fact, many of them scored higher on measures of self-determination, personal growth, and life satisfaction, not despite being single, because of how they'd built their lives around it. So what's going on in someone's mind when they genuinely, authentically choose to remain single? Think about how your brain handles solitude. Most people treat alone time like a waiting room, something to endure until the real experience begins. But for some people, solitude isn't a waiting room, it's the main event. Neuroscientists have found that individuals with a high degree of what's called dispositional autonomy, basically an intrinsic need to direct their own lives, show different patterns of activity in the prefrontal cortex when making decisions alone versus in social contexts. For these people, independence isn't just a preference, it's wired in. It's how their sense of self is constructed. When you take that away, even for good reasons, even in a loving relationship, something in them goes quiet. Something dims.
Now, imagine being that person and being told over and over that the thing that makes them feel most alive is actually a symptom of their dysfunction. That's the psychological burden many single-by-choice people carry. Not loneliness, but the exhausting work of defending a life that feels completely natural to them against a world that keeps diagnosing it. Here's a metaphor I love for this. Think of personality like a musical instrument. Most instruments are designed to play well in orchestras. They're built for harmony, for blending, for the collective sound, and that's beautiful. But some instruments, a solo piano, a solo cello, are built to produce something full and complete on their own. Putting them in an orchestra doesn't ruin them, but it also doesn't reveal what they do best. Some people are solo instruments, not broken, not incomplete, just designed for a different kind of music. But let's be fair here, because the psychology is nuanced. Not everyone who stays single is doing so from a place of health and self-knowledge. Some people stay single because they've been hurt so many times that vulnerability feels genuinely dangerous. Their nervous system has learned, through painful experience, that closeness leads to loss. Psychologists call this an anxious avoidant adaptation, and it's one of the more common psychological patterns we see in chronic singlehood. The brain, in its remarkable efficiency, decides if connection brings pain, then distance brings safety. And so it builds walls so automatically, so seamlessly, that the person inside them genuinely can't tell whether they're choosing solitude or hiding in it. This is where self-honesty becomes the most important tool a single person can have. There's a meaningful difference between I'm single because I love my freedom and I've done the work to understand myself, and I'm single because I've stopped believing I'm worth staying for. Both can look identical from the outside. Both might even feel similar from the inside, at least for a while. But one is liberation, and one is a very comfortable cage. And then there's a third type, the ones who are single not because of fear, not because of deep philosophical preference, but simply because they haven't found a relationship that improves on their baseline. Think about that for a second. We rarely frame it this way, but if someone has a rich inner life, a strong social network, meaningful work, and deep self-knowledge, they have set a very high bar. Not an impossibly high bar, not an arrogant bar, just a real one. And rather than settle for a relationship that offers less than what they already have, they wait. Or they stop waiting entirely and just live. Psychologist Bella DePaulo, who has spent decades studying single people, calls this single at heart, and she makes the case that for these individuals, their most authentic, meaningful, and fulfilling life is, in fact, a single one. Not a consolation prize, the actual prize.
There's something almost countercultural about that, isn't there? In a world that sells us love stories from birth, the fairy tale, the soulmate, the idea that we are half a person until someone completes us, choosing to be whole on your own feels almost radical. Jerry Maguire said, "You complete me," and we called it romantic. But what if you're already complete? What if the most honest thing you can say isn't "you complete me," but "I am complete, and I'd love to share that with someone who is too"? That reframe alone changes everything. Now, none of this means relationships aren't valuable. Of course they are. Human beings are social creatures. Loneliness, real loneliness, the involuntary kind, is genuinely harmful. Studies from Brigham Young University found that chronic social isolation carries health risks comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That's serious. But here's the key distinction. Loneliness and aloneness are not the same thing. You can feel crushingly lonely inside a relationship and deeply connected while living alone. The research on this is clear. What matters for well-being isn't your relationship status, it's the quality of your connections, however they're structured. So, if you're watching this and you're single, whether by choice, by circumstance, by heartbreak, or by something you haven't quite figured out yet, I want to offer you this. Your singlehood is not a sentence. It is not a waiting room. It is not evidence of your brokenness. It might be the result of self-knowledge so deep that you've refused to betray it. It might be a chapter in the longer story of your emotional growth. It might be, genuinely and beautifully, the life that fits you best. The question worth sitting with isn't, why am I still single? The better question, the more honest one, is, what does this say about what I value, what I fear, and what I'm building? Those answers will tell you far more about yourself than any relationship status ever could. And that kind of self-understanding, that's not loneliness. That's intimacy with yourself. And it might just be the most underrated form of psychology there is. If this hit close to home, whether it made you reflect on someone you know or maybe yourself, drop it in the comments. I genuinely read them. And if you want more of this kind of deep dive psychology content, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.